Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 622, and today is June 24th, 2024. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone, today joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing, buddy? How's it going?
Doing very well, Kyle. How are you?
Doing well, Connor. Just to update people, I was on Judge Napolitano's show, Judging Freedom, today. And so if you want to check that out, it's up at his YouTube channel. And I think they put out that show pretty much everywhere. If you could, leave a positive rating, review, or not a rating, but a little review, a comment on the show, that would be great. You can also just give it a thumbs up. Let them know that you like it when I'm on. Always helps me to get back on those programs. Additionally, you can support this show by sharing it at the Libertarian Institute. We also reprint the show on the blog at antiwar.com, and the Institute and antiwar.com are where you find essentially all of mine and Connor's work. This past week or so, we've been covering the news section for Dave DeCamp, so there are going to be, once again, several articles from myself and Connor Freeman and Will Porter discussed on today's show, all published at antiwar.com, but we are reprinting those at the Institute. If you're just an Institute person, that's where you go first thing in the morning. You can find them all there. Additionally, you can subscribe to the show on YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version. It's up anywhere you could listen to audio podcasts. And of course, you can follow the show on Twitter at @con_interest. I'm at Kyle Anzalone_. And Connor, I can never remember your Twitter handle, but go ahead and tell the audience before you start talking about your articles here.
Yeah, absolutely. It's at Freeman's Mind 96.
All right. Thank you, Connor. And let's get rolling. What do you got for us today?
Okay, so the first story here is about we're moving toward annexation of the West Bank. The radical right wing in Netanyahu's fragile ruling coalition is really seizing the opportunity of the war on Gaza, with all eyes on the besieged enclave, where we have nearly 40,000 people slaughtered already and hundreds of thousands of people starving to death, and all the international news being focused on what's going on in Gaza. Really, it's been open season in the West Bank, and we've been covering that throughout the months. But it does look like now Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister, who also holds an important position in the defense ministry, where he's effectively the governor of the West Bank, in charge of settlements and demolishing Palestinians' homes, is really taking the opportunity now, with Netanyahu's cooperation, to seize the West Bank outright, kill the two-state solution. And obviously this is going to, if you can imagine, ramp up tensions in the region much higher, I think, if this really spills over and goes where it appears to be headed. So I write here, this is for antiwar.com, new legal powers for settlers facilitate West Bank expansion. This is from the 23rd. The Israeli Defense Forces quietly issued an order which transfers substantial legal powers over the occupied West Bank to the Settlements Administration, to bureaucrats working for the Settlements Administration under Israel's extremist minister, Bezalel Smotrich. And this came originally from a report in The Guardian. And this paves the way for annexation of the territory, illegally occupied since 1967, where millions of Palestinian Muslims and Christians live. And this objective, which will eliminate the potential for a two-state solution, has long been sought by Smotrich as well as other far-right elements in Netanyahu's ruling coalition. So the order was posted on the IDF's website on May 29th. That shifts responsibility for dozens of bylaws at the West Bank civil administration from the IDF to civilians working for Smotrich at the Defense Ministry. And this is going to facilitate the expansion of Jewish-only colonies, and critically, or settlements as they're more commonly known. So critically, Finance Minister Smotrich also holds this position in the Defense Ministry, where he serves as a de facto governor of the occupied territory, allowing him to expropriate land and expand settlement construction. So he and his ultra-Orthodox settler allies are aiming to achieve command of the heretofore IDF-run civil administration, or large parts of it, as a means of gaining Israeli sovereignty over the West Bank. So since Smotrich took his position leading the Settlements Administration last February, Israel has set records for illegal settlement construction. In fact, there's a report in CNN from, I believe, last week about Smotrich. He's been advocating, I guess, since last month, that they want to they want to build 10,000 more settlements at least. And he says they're going to build new settlements for each state that unilaterally recognizes Palestine as its own state. So we're up to Slovenia, Spain, Ireland, and I believe Norway as well. And so, Smotrich is taking advantage of that, retaliating not against those states, but this is a rogue apartheid state, so they're going to take all their aggression out on the Palestinians, as we've seen here with the Karim Khan, the ICC chief prosecutor, seeking arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant, or the what's going on with the International Court of Justice. All of the frustration gets taken out on the Palestinians, of course, and so. Since Smotrich took this position as heading the Settlements Administration last February, Israel is, as I said, set records for this illegal settlement construction. And as Al Jazeera notes, responsibility for monitoring illegal construction in the occupied West Bank has come under Smotrich, meaning that illegal settlement or outpost construction is going to be ignored and eventually approved, while Palestinian construction would be subject to intense scrutiny over permits and often demolished. And we've seen a big escalation in home demolitions taking place in East Jerusalem, in particular, in the last several months. So Smotrich himself is a resident of the West Bank settlement of Kedumim, and has thus far greenlit the legalization of previously unauthorized outposts, approved the building of thousands of new illegal settlement homes, and further impeded the ability of Palestinians to travel or build their own homes. And the civil administration mainly oversees planning and construction in Area C of the West Bank, which comprises 60% of the territory and is under full Israeli security administrative control. And this transfer of powers will cover the management of, among other things, building regulations, administration of agriculture, bathing locations, parks, and forestry. Now, last year, Smotrich vowed he would seek authority to demolish Palestinian residences in both areas A and B, where the PA, the Palestinian Authority, maintains civil control under a national, they want to use a national security pretext to destroy Palestinians' homes in areas A and B. And just to keep in mind a little bit of context, the Israelis have seized over the years since the Nakba 78%. At least now, it's probably more given the war in Gaza, but 78% of historical Palestine. The Palestinians have 22%, and even Hamas, as well as the PLO, have said for years now, decades for the PLO, and years, at least since 2017 for Hamas, that they would accept a two-state solution along 1967 borders. But they're going to go ahead and steal the rest of the West Bank here. So, and obviously they're destroying Gaza so that it's not, so the Palestinians can't even live there anymore. So what we're watching really is the Nakba 2.0, or however you want to put it. Now, according to The Guardian, Smotrich and his allies ultimately desired direct control by the central government and its ministries, and the transfer reduces the likelihood of legal checks on settlement expansion and development. Now, last month, as the IDF and settlers escalated their attacks on Palestinians living in the territory, Smotrich threatened Palestinians in the West Bank that they could be subjected to the kinds of mass slaughter ongoing in the besieged Gaza Strip. He said, "We will turn you into ruins like in the Gaza Strip." Since the war began, more than 550 Palestinians, including at least 137 children, have been killed in the West Bank by settlers in the IDF. Smotrich supports ethnic cleansing, annexing, and resettling the Gaza Strip as well. And as we've mentioned before, UNICEF said last year was the deadliest year on record for Palestinian children in the West Bank, and it's only getting worse as we move further into 2024. Now, Israeli human rights lawyer Michael Safford explains, quote, "The bottom line is that for anyone who thought the question of annexation was foggy, this order should end any doubts. What this order does is transfer vast areas of administrative power from the military commander to Israeli civilians working for the government." So in April, Smotrich appointed Hillel Roth as a deputy in the civil administration, focusing on regulations for illegal settlements and outposts. Roth worked as an official with an NGO tied to Smotrich's far-right religious Zionism party, and is a former resident of Yitzhar, an infamously violent and radical settlement. And since former General Benny Gantz quit Netanyahu's now disbanded war cabinet over disagreements regarding Gaza, the prime minister has become ever more reliant on the extremist pro-settler factions within his fragile ruling coalition. If he loses Ben Gvir and Smotrich, there goes his coalition, and he's liable to be, he's convicted for corruption and being criminally negligible for the, allowing the October 7th attack to happen, among other things, which could, either land him in prison or you could lose a lot of his personal wealth. So, it's very important. Netanyahu is doing everything he can to stay in power, including potentially starting a war with Lebanon. So as Safford continues, he clarifies that while the head of the civil administration reports the military command, Roth only answers to Smotrich himself. And 3 Israeli jurists concluded last year that such a transfer of power, as we're talking about here, may amount to legal annexation. As Mariav Zonzin, a senior analyst for Israel-Palestine at the Crisis Group, clarifies, the big story here is that this is no longer creeping annexation or de facto annexation. It is actual annexation. This is the legalization and normalization of a long-term policy. Smotrich is basically reestablishing the way in which the occupation works by taking out a large part out of the hands of the military. So we're moving from 57 years of brutal apartheid, fascist military dictatorship in the West Bank into outright ethnic cleansing. Now, earlier this month, Smotrich gave a speech in the West Bank outlining his strategy to, quote, first and foremost, prevent the establishment of a terror state in the very heart of the land of Israel. So obviously, he's saying what Judea and Samaria, as they call it, is Israel. He declared these moves will be mega dramatic and one of the kind that changes systems DNA. So all of that, Gaza, East Jerusalem, the West Bank, that's all the heart of Israel, the land of Israel, as he says. Now, the finance head acknowledged the need to circumvent international criticism. Therefore, the defense ministry will still ostensibly be involved in the process, he said. However, Smotrich added, we created a separate civilian system so that they won't say that we are doing annexation here. He also made clear Netanyahu is with us full on. And so obviously Netanyahu has some political calculations that are working here for why he's going to support this move. But as you noted on the judge's show earlier today, Netanyahu, has his biggest achievement so far as he's concerned and made clear and stated publicly is preventing the establishment of a Palestinian state. And that is going to be his legacy, or at least he intends it to be. So, of course, he's on board with Smotrich because this is really their opportunity now. I mean, they were never going to lift the siege on Gaza. They were never going to end the occupation of the West Bank. And they used the October 7th attack, in retrospect, as an excuse to carry out the kinds of ethnic cleansing on the level that they probably wouldn't have been able to achieve otherwise. And so that's what we're seeing here as well. Okay, speaking of that, this next story, IDF kills over 100 Palestinians in weekend strikes across the Gaza Strip. I wrote this on June 23rd for antiwar.com. Tel Aviv carried out several attacks across Gaza this weekend. On Saturday, Gaza's health ministry said more than 100 Palestinians were killed, along with 169 others wounded in 24 hours amid various strikes. I believe the death toll has gone up since to over 120. And this was the deadliest day in the Strip since the June 8th massacre on the Nusriat refugee camp, where 274 Palestinians were slaughtered and hundreds more were wounded. A UN facility was hit on Sunday, killing at least 4 people. Now, on Friday, the IDF bombarded areas in southern Gaza and outside Rafah near the International Committee of the Red Cross base at the Al-Mawasi camp, a location Tel Aviv claimed was a safe zone for displaced Palestinians following its invasion of Rafah. Now, Palestinian officials say 2 Israeli strikes killed a minimum of 25 people and wounded 50 others, the Associated Press reported. The victims were among hundreds of Palestinians sheltering in tents outside the ICRC office. And witnesses whose family members were slaughtered in the bombing told the AP that the IDF fired a second volley that killed people making their way out of their tents. The Red Cross denounced the mass killing at the camp and noted the warring parties were aware of the location of its humanitarian office, which was also struck during the attack. They put out a statement that said, firing so dangerously close to humanitarian structures of whose locations the parties to the conflict are aware and which are clearly marked with Red Cross emblems puts the lives of civilians and Red Cross staff at risk. The strike damaged the structure of the Red Cross office, which is surrounded by hundreds of displaced civilians living in tents, including many of our Palestinian colleagues. A day later, Al Jazeera documented further assaults on the Al-Mawasi camp, with Tarek Abu Azum, one of the outlet's correspondents on the ground, reporting that witnesses said Israeli tanks carried out a sudden and unexpected incursion in Al-Mawasi, launching a number of artillery shells toward the evacuation centers and makeshift tents. The entire area of Al-Mawasi is an evacuation center. It's a very tiny strip of land where more than 100,000 displaced Palestinians have been taking refuge. It's the place where field hospitals have been established, and it's a center for humanitarian organizations. In northern Gaza on Saturday, 43 more Palestinians were murdered by Israeli attacks on the Shati refugee camp, as well as Gaza's Tufa neighborhood. Abu Azum said that a residential area in the Shadi refugee camp was targeted, another location where displaced Palestinians from the north were told they could seek refuge. He said rescuers with the help of civilians are trying to sift through the rubble to find survivors. The casualties arriving at the Al-Aqsa hospital are surging. And the head of Gaza's government media office told the outlet that in Shadi, 24 people were killed in 7 homes. Gaza's civil defense reported recovering 19 bodies from Tufa. Now, on Sunday, 8 Palestinians were killed and multiple others wounded in Gaza City near an aid center sheltering hundreds of people. That was the primary headquarters of the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA, in the besieged enclave. The airstrike hit the compound's main gate. This facility is used to distribute the minuscule amount of aid that reaches the strip. And according to UNRWA, since the start of the Gaza onslaught, that's now 188 UN facilities that have been targeted during 445 Israeli bombing raids, killing 500 displaced Palestinians and wounding more than 1,500. Additionally, the IDF has murdered a record 193 UN workers. In an X post, the IDF took credit for its, quote, precise strike on the UNRWA aid center, but blamed Hamas and Islamic Jihad, claiming it has become a base of their operations. And as you might have predicted, they did not provide evidence for those claims. So over the last several days, Israeli tanks have advanced further into the western and northern parts of Rafah, where the southern Gaza city's residents are saying the pace of Israeli operations is accelerating. Reuters reported the IDF is moving toward a complete capture of the city, where, of course, approximately 1.5 million Palestinians were displaced to throughout the first 7 months of the genocide. And more than 1 million people have been displaced from Rafah since the IDF seized the vital Rafah border crossing with Egypt on May 7 and subsequently destroyed it, deliberately exacerbating the already catastrophic humanitarian crisis caused by the bombing campaign and the starvation siege. And the director of Gaza's Kamal Adwan Hospital said Saturday that 4 children starved to death this week. I believe the hospital is in the north. We lost a child in the nursery department of the hospital during the first few hours. He is the 4th child to die in the hospital in the last week due to malnutrition, he told a news conference. The World Health Organization's Richard Pieperkorn said, we've seen a massive displacement over the last weeks and months, so we know that combination in the heat can cause a rise in diseases. We have water contamination because of hot water, and we will have much more food spoilage because of the high temperature. We'll get insect mosquitoes and flies, dehydration, heat stroke. And the WHO has demanded that the Rafah border crossing be reopened to facilitate aid shipments as well as permit the medical evacuation, he says, of at least 10,000 wounded people and wounded and maimed Palestinians that require treatment abroad. Of course, during an interview with Punchbowl News, Netanyahu declared that Israel is not purposely killing or starving civilians in Gaza, calling the allegation a blood libel against the Jewish people. And since October, the IDF has slaughtered 300, and this has probably gone up. In fact, I know it has, but 37,598 Palestinian Muslims and Christians, including 15,000 children, and 86,000 more have been wounded. The UN says the IDF has destroyed more than half of all buildings in Gaza. Beneath that rubble, at least 10,000 Palestinians are said to be missing or presumed dead. But of course, anyway, I presume that that's a massive undercount. Okay. This next story, Israel plans more assassinations of Hamas figures. This is from antiwar.com on June 21st. I wrote, Tel Aviv plans to ramp up its efforts to assassinate Hamas leaders in order to force the group toward accepting a ceasefire deal. A senior Israeli official has told The Times. Prime Minister Netanyahu's government has ruled out a ceasefire or a hostage deal to end the war, which would collapse his fragile far-right ruling coalition, instead seeking to annihilate Hamas, really using Hamas as an excuse to ethnically cleanse the Gaza Strip. And speaking with the outlet on the condition of anonymity, the official said, quote, following the refusal of the leadership of Hamas to accept the deal, Israel has international legitimacy to continue carrying out operations to assassinate senior Hamas members and release hostages. They're talking about, by the way, not just killing Hamas figures in Lebanon and these illegal strikes or Gaza. They're also talking about killing Hamas figures in Qatar as well. Now, though the stated goal of Netanyahu's onslaught in Gaza is the eradication of Hamas, of course, General Charles Q. Brown, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, U.S. intelligence, Israeli intelligence, and now the Israeli military believe that goal is unachievable. Regardless, Tel Aviv has assassinated some Hamas figures, including at least 2 senior members. In January, Salah al-Arori, an operations chief, was killed in an Israeli drone strike in Beirut. Marwan Issa, the chief of staff of the Al-Aqsa Brigades, was killed as well in March during a bombing of central Gaza's Nusayrat refugee camp. Hamas's leader in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar, and Mohammed Deif, who leads the group's military wing, remain alive, and Israeli intelligence claims they're hiding in tunnels beneath the city of Khan Yunis, which has been destroyed. And according to the Times, senior Hamas members outside Gaza, including members of its political bureau, are deemed targets as well. Now, Biden unveiled a ceasefire proposal last month, which he framed as an Israeli conception, despite Netanyahu's immediate rejection of any halt in the mass slaughter. And subsequently, the offer was supported by the UN Security Council as well as Hamas. The deal consisted of multiple phases. In the first phase, there's going to be a 6-week truce, along with an initial exchange of hostages and prisoners. It also proposed an Israeli withdrawal from densely populated areas, the return of displaced civilians to their homes, and significant increases in humanitarian aid. Amidst the first phase, negotiations were supposed to take place, moving toward a permanent ceasefire during the second phase. And Israeli officials believed the language of the deal was vague enough that the Israelis and Hamas could enter into the first stage without ultimately ending its genocidal war, which is Netanyahu made clear today that, he said that explicitly, which is just basically a way of taking everything off the table. And recognizing this flaw, Hamas issued a response which contained, as the Washington Post described, amendments including a timeline for a permanent ceasefire and the complete withdrawal of Israeli troops from Gaza. So since then, Israeli officials deem this a complete refusal when it's really anything but. And Blinken, Secretary of State Blinken, has only blamed Hamas for the lack of progress, of course. And so Biden has said he believes a deal is unlikely anytime soon, and Israel has vowed following the destruction of Rafah, the mass killing of Palestinians is going to continue apace. And, I put in that extra background information just because the article from the Times, the most important thing about it is just this point they're making that they're going to start attempting to assassinate all these Hamas figures. They really haven't gotten the top guys at all. But, ostensibly the argument is, well, we're doing this to push them toward a ceasefire. And I needed to, prove that that's all nonsense. But the important thing is, of course, that we're going to see more illegal assassinations taking place and therefore an expansion of the war. So, okay, this next story is about all the chaos going on in Netanyahu's coalition and some of the internal Israeli politics. So this is from June 20th. Netanyahu accuses Security Minister Ben-Gvir of leaking state secrets, government in crisis. So major fractures within Netanyahu's ruling coalition threaten to collapse the government, reports The New Arab. Netanyahu's grip on power depends on the support of extremist and ultra-Orthodox parties, but the Israeli leader is increasingly at odds with National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, head of the Jewish Power Party, who he is accused of leaking state secrets. Now, other disputes have led some factions to threaten they will leave the coalition as well. Now, one critical controversy is Ben-Gvir's demand to join the now disbanded Israeli War Cabinet, which was formed shortly after the October 7th attack and the onset of the onslaught in Gaza. Netanyahu dissolved the body last Monday following resignations of Benny Gantz, the former defense minister, and a member of the Knesset, Gadi Eisenkot, and they're both of the National Unity Party. Now, they didn't have enough men in the coalition, so it didn't collapse it yet. But the prime minister will replace the emergency government with a limited consultative team. Netanyahu told Minister Ben-Gvir this is a quote from the Likud. Netanyahu told Ben-Gvir one simple thing. Whoever wants to be a partner in the limited security consultation team must prove that he is not leaking state secrets or private conversations. In response to Likud, Jewish Power proclaim they will support a bill forcing ministers to submit to lie detector tests only if it applies to those with pacemakers as well. Netanyahu was fitted for a pacemaker recently. And the latest point of contention comes after Netanyahu implored Ben-Gvir to back the rabbi law, which will shift decision-making for the appointment of rabbis from local councils to the Shah's party-led Ministry of Religious Affairs, which critics say will embed clientelism in the process for the benefit of the ultra-Orthodox party. And the Shah's party is an ultra-Orthodox partner, and they've demanded the passing as a condition for remaining within Likud's coalition. So, fearing he lacks enough support to get the law passed, the embattled prime minister shelved the vote last Wednesday. Subsequently, Ari Deri, the head of the Shah's party, called Netanyahu and threatened to quit the government. And the fight could collapse the coalition. It's unlikely Netanyahu can survive new elections without Jewish power or Shah's backing him. Ben-Gvir is a radical Jewish supremacist who has called for Palestinian women to be shot dead if they approach the Gaza border and insisted Palestinian prisoners should just be executed to free up Israeli prison space. Additionally, he's consistently endorsed, just like, Smotrich, ethnic cleansing and Israeli resettlement of Gaza. And another issue that risks Netanyahu's position is the move to subject some members of the politically powerful ultra-Orthodox student community to conscription. So so far, this community, which is subsidized by the citizenry, which very much angers much of the general public, is exempt. They're exempt from the military draft and they're subsidized. And this is while hundreds of Israeli troops have died in the ground campaign in Gaza and thousands more have been wounded. So Ben-Gvir is in trouble as well. Israel's high court is raising alarms regarding his unprecedented power over the police due to a vexed law passed when Netanyahu returned to power in December 2022. Watchdog groups petitioned the court to repeal the law, which they say threatens the right to protest as well as the freedom of expression. So beyond his myriad political vulnerabilities, Netanyahu is facing harsh criticism from his military over the impossible objectives of the war in Gaza. On Wednesday, Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari, the IDF spokesman, excoriated Netanyahu during his interview with Channel 13 News, saying, "The business of destroying Hamas, making Hamas disappear, is simply throwing sand in the eyes of the public. Hamas is an idea. It's a party. It's rooted in the hearts of the people. Whoever thinks we can eliminate Hamas is wrong." And this weekend, the Israeli military announced they were going to begin daily tactical pauses along one of the main roads in Gaza to relieve a backlog of aid shipments. And Netanyahu and Ben-Gvir immediately deemed this unacceptable and called for the sacking of whoever was responsible for conceiving of the new policy. The supposed humanitarian aid route has led to no changes on the ground. According to the head of the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, that's UNRWA again, the entire population of Gaza is facing catastrophic levels of food insecurity, and hundreds of thousands are suffering from full-blown famine conditions resulting from the blockade and wholesale destruction of the Strip's infrastructure. And of course, that's not what's riling up the Israeli public. It's the more internal domestic politics. So now we're moving over to China. Got a couple of stories here. Washington approves a $360 million arms sale to Taiwan. The State Department announced this last Tuesday that they had greenlit a $360 million arms sale to Taipei and consists of hundreds of armed drones, missile equipment, and other support material. China views Taiwan as part of its territory, of course, and while it prefers to reclaim the de facto independent island peacefully, it has not ruled out using force if its red lines are crossed. The latest sale comprises 291 Altius 600M systems, which are drones or unmanned aerial vehicles armed with warheads. The State Department released notes that 720 Switchblade drones, as well described as extended range loitering munitions, are also included in the package. The statement went on to claim that the sale serves U.S. national economic and security interests by supporting the recipient's continued efforts to modernize its armed forces and maintain a credible defense capability. The hawkish Lai Ching-te, the new Taiwanese president of the Democratic Progressive Party, thanked Washington for the new hardware, insisting they will increase regional stability. Yeah, right. In the future, we will continue to strengthen Taiwan's national defense strength, whether through military purchases or our own efforts, he said. And you can imagine, all the chaos we've seen under the previous governments from Tsai Ing-wen. He was her vice president. It's only going to get worse here under President Lai. So Wednesday's announcement follows reports this week that Chinese President Xi Jinping told European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen last year that he believes the hawkish American posture in the region and its increased military support for the island constitute an attempt to provoke an invasion by Beijing. Earlier this month, Admiral Samuel Paparo, the head of Indo-Pacific Command, told the Washington Post columnist, the neoconservative Josh Rogan, that he plans to wage a hellscape drone war, launching thousands of UAVs, drone boats, and unmanned submarines against China if it attacks the island. Remember when we were all supposed to be scared of Iran's UAV terror? He says, I want to turn the Taiwan Strait into an unmanned hellscape using a number of classified capabilities, he threatened. So I quote, so that I can make their lives utterly miserable for a month, which buys me time for the rest of everything. His predecessor, of course, Admiral John Aquilino, said last year that he was instructed by Pentagon Chief Lloyd Austin, as well as President Biden, to prepare for direct war with China over Taiwan's sovereignty. He says, what I can tell you is the secretary and the president have tasked me with two missions. The first is to prevent this conflict. And then the second one is, if I fail at mission one, to be ready and prepared to fight and win. The United States military, he claims, is manned, trained, equipped, postured, and ready to execute both of these missions. That's dubious at best. Now, this was another confirmation that the White House has discarded the decades-old policy of strategic ambiguity regarding, what the U.S. role. What role the U.S. would play in the event of a cross-strait war. And this, the strategic ambiguity, I hate to admit that a government policy has worked, but under the status quo, we haven't seen a war yet between Taiwan and China, and that has all really changed since the Obama years, and especially under Biden. So since taking office, Biden has made several ostensible gaffes, suggesting the U.S. in fact has a defense commitment with the island, and we don't. But this is totally unconstitutional, but this is how they work. So he's saying that American men and women will be deployed to fight and die to protect Taiwan's de facto independence. Last year, Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines, and then top Asia official on the National Security Council, Kurt Campbell, the architect of the whole Asia pivot, reiterated that the policy has been changed from ambiguity to strategic clarity or an overt war footing. Not nearly enough attention has been brought to this drastic change in China policy and Taiwan policy. Unfortunately, it's been overlooked by the mainstream media, but it's very clear that that's the case, that we do have a defense commitment one way or another with Taiwan. And that's extremely provocative to China and does cross, as President Xi personally told Biden in Bali, that this is the first red line that must not be crossed. This is arguably a bigger deal than even NATO expansion to Ukraine, and we can see what that's gotten us. So since last year, in another about-face on long-standing U.S. policies regarding the island, the U.S. has provided Taipei with billions in military aid, further angering Beijing. U.S. officials say their goal is, to convert the island into a giant weapons depot. Big headline in the New York Times. A war over Taiwan with direct U.S. intervention would likely turn nuclear, and China has the ability to inflict severe damage to U.S. security if such a fight were to take place, including strikes with strategic weapons across the continental United States. Okay, this last story. China's Xi says the U.S. attempted to trick him into Taiwan invasion report. And I wrote this for antiwar.com on the 18th. During a conversation in 2023 with European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, President Xi accused the U.S. of attempting to goad him into invading the island of Taiwan. This is according to people familiar with the matter who spoke to Financial Times. Despite a long spate of provocations by Washington that threatened to cross China's first red line, undermining cross-strait peace and regional security more broadly, the Chinese leader said he will not take the bait. U.S. provocations have continued into the current year. The meeting between the two leaders took place in April of last year, although Xi's claim about American intentions did not make it into any official press releases following their conversation. At the time, the Chinese embassy in the U.S. said on the Taiwan question, Xi Jinping stressed that it is at the core of China's core interests. The Chinese government and the Chinese people will never stand for anyone trying to take advantage of the question. If anyone expects China to compromise or concede on the Taiwan question, they're having a pipe dream and would shoot themselves in the foot. One person told the outlet that Xi issued a similar warning to Chinese officials as well. Now, according to the same embassy statement, von der Leyen, quote, reiterated the EU has no intention to change its longstanding one China policy, recognizes the government of the PRC, the People's Republic, as the sole legal government representing the whole of China, and hopes that peace and stability will be maintained across the Taiwan Strait. And the Financial Times report notes this is the first instance of Xi making this claim to a foreign leader, adding, quote, he has also said that a conflict with the U.S. would destroy many of China's achievements and undermine his plan for the country's great rejuvenation by 2049. So this is not a war he wants. This is a war the American foreign policy blob and the neocons want. Kui Tiankai, former Chinese ambassador to Washington, referred to the U.S. when he told the Asia Society in January that Beijing, quote, will not fall into the trap somebody may be preparing for us. Although it appears to be changing now, for more than half a century, the one China policy was also Washington's official position regarding cross-strait relations. In 1979, the U.S. cut formal ties with Taipei and recognized Beijing. The U.S. continued selling arms to the island to bolster its defenses until the current administration. And until the current administration, obviously Biden changed this last year, we never financed such purchases by providing military aid. Now, in addition, prior to the Biden administration, the U.S. also maintained a policy of strategic ambiguity regarding whether or not the U.S. would militarily defend the island, its erstwhile ally, if mainland forces moved to reclaim the de facto independent territory by violence. And this, as I said, kept the peace for many decades, leaving both sides uncertain about what the U.S. role in such a conflict would entail. And behind the scenes, as Gareth Porter laid out, at the Gray Zone, this was the dual deterrence strategy, and it prevented Taiwanese officials from declaring de jure independence, which would likely spark a war. Cross-strait warfare would almost certainly turn nuclear if the U.S. intervened. But in 2011, Barack Obama and Joe Biden launched the Pivot to Asia, the largest military buildup since the Second World War, shifting 2/3 of all American air and naval forces to the Asia Pacific, along with hundreds of bases encircling China for a future direct war. Former President Donald Trump further ramped up the pivot by drastically expanding the U.S. military presence in the South China Sea, challenging Beijing's territorial claims in the waters, waging a trade war against Beijing, pushing through massive unprecedented arms sales to Taiwan, and upgrading diplomatic ties with the island by dispatching high-level officials there during the pandemic. Subsequent to the 2020 U.S. election, the pivot's architect, Kurt Campbell, became the top Asia official on the National Security Council and declared that the period of engagement with China that, the period broadly described as engagement has come to an end. We're shifting our military might to the Indo-Pacific, and our focus and the paradigm is extreme competition. Biden has he's been much more hawkish on China than any of his predecessors, including Trump or Obama. He, in addition to doubling down on Trump's policies, the White House has sent at least 200 troops to Taiwan to train local forces for war with the mainland. We've expanded National Guard programs, training the Taiwanese for war on U.S. soil, repeatedly sailed warships through and spy planes over the Taiwan Strait, and deployed Green Berets to Kinmen Island, just a couple miles off the Chinese coast. In addition, the administration has secured rights to more bases in the Philippines, provocatively close to Taiwan, and worked to, as I said, discarded the strategic ambiguity policy. So furthermore, the U.S. has repeatedly sent congressional delegations to the island in response to these political missions have provoked massive scale Chinese military exercises, the largest to date anyway, including blockade simulations around Taiwan. Doesn't matter. Virtually every branch of the U.S. military has accepted war with China as a foregone conclusion. They're preparing accordingly. We've even reportedly, the U.S. has been in talks with Taipei about bringing Taiwan under Washington's nuclear umbrella, as with South Korea or Japan. The war fever is utterly bipartisan, with congressional Republicans demanding the U.S. arm Taiwan to the teeth. During a recent visit to Taiwan, Representative Michael McCall, the Republican chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, boasted that even though there are debates on other theaters of war, referring to Ukraine or Israel, I can tell you there is no division and no dissension when it comes to Taiwan in Congress. Since leaving office, former members of Trump's administration, including Pompeo, former State Department Secretary and CIA Director and National Security Advisor John Bolton, they've outright called for the U.S. to recognize Taiwan as a sovereign nation. Besides Xi, Chinese officials have consistently made clear to American counterparts Taiwan is a red line. They seek peaceful reunification, but will not rule out force. And all of these policies make war vastly more likely. I put in that note there about the Trump administration because we could be walking into an even worse situation here. It seems to get worse with each administration, but the Trump, the hawkishness on China, even though he hasn't been as bad as Biden, or he wasn't, he's going to pick up wherever Biden leaves off. So where does that leave us?
All right, Connor, I just got one story that I want to talk about today just because I am concerned that this one is going to develop rather quickly, and if I held it on to Wednesday's show, it would probably be outdated. So, this one I wrote for antiwar.com today, June 24th. Russia warns U.S. retaliatory measures will follow deadly attack on Crimea. In response to a deadly strike on the Crimean Peninsula that killed 4 and wounded over 100, the Russian Foreign Ministry said that Washington had effectively become a party to the war, and Moscow would certainly retaliate. The Kremlin says American missiles were used in the attack. On Monday, the Russian Foreign Ministry summoned the U.S. ambassador to express outrage over Sunday's attack on Crimea. The Kremlin claims that American ATACMS missiles were used, that Washington provided intelligence to Kiev to coordinate the attack, and the U.S. drone was operating near Sevastopol when the assault on civilian targets took place. According to a statement from the Russian Foreign Ministry, the U.S. has effectively become a party to the war on Ukraine's side, adding that retaliatory measures will certainly follow. The Kremlin said the deadly assault involved 5 ATACMS. The Defense Ministry reported that 4 were shot down and a 5th exploded over a civilian area. Today on Andrew Napolitano's show, Larry Johnson pointed out there was a military base somewhat nearby that this missile could have been targeting. But importantly, Russia labeled the missile barrage a terrorist attack, and it occurred on one of the most important Orthodox holidays, the Day of the Holy Trinity. I think this is somewhat important, Connor, because last year the Ukrainian Defense Ministry posted a video threatening Russian civilians on vacations in Crimea. The video shows civilians fleeing an explosion and telling the Russian audience, "We warned you last summer to stay away from Crimea." And so, as much as this may have been an attack on the Russian military base that went wrong, also I think possible that this was something that may have been intentional. That as Ukraine gets more desperate, the intimidation of the Russian civilian population is something that Ukraine is probably going to look to extract. Additionally, as Russia ramps up their war in Ukraine, more Ukrainian civilians will likely be killed, and Kiev may just see this as blatant retaliation. So the Russian Defense Ministry reported that the ATACMS were cluster bombs. Such bombs contain submunitions that are designed as anti-personnel weapons meant to scatter submunitions over a large area. The U.S. has outlawed the import of the cluster weapons because of how deadly the submunitions are for civilians. President Biden is likely in violation of this law by shipping the weapons to Ukraine. The peninsula was annexed by Moscow in 2014, but Kiev and Washington maintain that the Kremlin must hand control back to Ukraine to end the war. In Russian President Vladimir Putin's recent ceasefire offer to Kiev, he said Ukraine would have to recognize Russia's claim over the territory. Russia suffered a second major attack on Sunday in Russia's southern Dagestan Republic. At least 19, I believe that it has now increased to 20. People were killed and 25 were injured in a coordinated assault on various places of worship. There are reports on some pretty horrendous atrocities being reported against clergy. Additionally, I saw that 15 of the killed were members of the Russian security forces. So it seemed that the attacks were places of worship as well as law enforcement agencies. And Russia also deemed this a terror attack, although I don't think I've seen anything from the Kremlin pointing the finger at the West for this attack. And Connor, with that, we'll have to wrap up the show today. Everybody, thank you all so much for tuning in. More later in the week.
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, everybody.